From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ambassador David Satterfield. Baker Briefing tackles the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day. We seek to provide meaningful analysis and independent perspective. Today's topic, oil production cuts. On April 2nd, Saudi Arabia and other OPEC plus oil producers made waves around the world when they announced voluntary oil production cuts, which are to begin in May and extend through the end of 2023. This announcement came as a shock to the oil market. Here we'll unpack its broad-ranging implications, from prices paid at the pump to U.S. energy security and the issue of U.S. Saudi relations. Now, I'm grateful to have three of my Baker Institute colleagues with me today. Jim Krane and Kristian Ulrichsen are sitting with me here in Houston, and Mark Finley is with us from D.C. Welcome to all of you. Mark, the oil production cuts were initially announced by the Saudi press agency, and it took about a day for the full details to be confirmed by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, better known as OPEC. So let's be clear here at the beginning. What do we know about these cuts? What will they mean for oil markets? Why did they come now and so soon after senior Saudi officials indicated there would be no production cuts?
All great questions, Ambassador Satterfield, and ones that I think will be struggling to, some of those dimensions will be struggling to answer for a long time to come. What we know is that, led by the Saudis, some of the OPEC and participating non-OPEC countries that have been cooperating in managing production going all the way back to 2016 have made these kind of surprise voluntary cuts on top of the existing production cuts that the group had already had in place. As you mentioned, up until April 2nd, they had been saying, yeah, the status quo, the cuts that we already had in place, we're going to leave through the rest of the year, and had been very clearly telegraphing their intent to maintain the status quo even in the days leading up to the meeting. Heading into the meeting, a survey of oil analysts done by one of the news services had unanimous agreement that they were going to roll over. And I think the element of surprise is a key dimension of this. So what happened was about 8 of these participating countries announced that they would make additional production cuts totaling about 1.2 million barrels a day. The biggest cut by far comes from Saudi Arabia. Russia had previously announced that it was cutting production in March in response to EU and G7 sanctions. They announced that they were joining in with this agreement. So the total advertised cuts add up, including Russia, to 1.7 million barrels a day. What's noteworthy is that they didn't use the process. This group's been meeting for 7 years, and they have a committee that monitors the market and makes recommendations to the full ministerial. That committee was supposed to meet on Monday. And so this announcement skirted the whole process by making unilateral cuts before the ministerial monitoring committee even had a chance to meet. And they were left trying to play catch up and endorse this move after the fact. The timing, I think, is also interesting, and we can discuss further. It was not done when oil prices were at their bottom. After Silicon Valley Bank failed, oil prices briefly dipped to about $70 a barrel. As the financial damage seems to have been contained, oil prices had actually risen by $10 by the time this announcement was made. So I think the question of why now is a great question, and as is the question of why do it outside of your established decision-making processes.
And how have U.S. officials reacted, Mark?
Unlike the fall, when President Biden went and was refused, this time around, the U.S. reaction has been very muted. The initial U.S. public reaction was to say, no, that's not advisable. But we didn't see the volume of commentary. The president did not say there's going to be consequences for this like he did last fall. In fact, the United States officials quietly admitted yesterday that the Saudis had even given them a heads up about this. And so there seems to be a deliberate effort to not use this as a way to dial up the tensions.
Jim, you've stated that since President Biden took office, the Saudi oil strategy has been consistently less predictable and less favorable to U.S. interests. So tell us, how has the Saudi oil strategy changed during the time of this administration, and why?
Well, thanks, Ambassador. Yeah, so I would go back a little bit before Biden took office. So 2015, when upon the death of King Abdullah, much more cautious ruler than the person that succeeded him, King Salman and his son, Mohammed bin Salman. I think they came in and put a new stamp on Saudi oil market strategy that now I think we're hearing this called Saudi First. OPEC also changed in 2016 when it expanded and brought Russia on board, and we had this sort of Russia-Saudi axis forming and sort of brought strategizing within OPEC, distanced it a bit more from the U.S. I think there's some exceptions here. The Saudis were pretty comfortable cooperating with the Trump administration for the most part. But when Biden took office, I think for the U.S., Saudi oil market strategy began to take a more confrontational tone. And we saw Saudi Arabia becoming much more of a price hawk. And this was new, going all the way back to the 80s. The Saudis really used to be the cool head within OPEC. There were other price hawks in the organization like Iran and Venezuela. From time to time, the Saudis would be opposing them. Really, the mantra was, trying to prevent demand destruction from high prices. And now we've got this more activist Saudi Arabia within OPEC. We're even seeing them preempting when they see something that points towards a price fall, preempting those with production cuts and chasing after higher prices or trying to defend higher prices with their moves. So as Mark referred to with the October cut, they did this when oil was above $90 a barrel. Prince Abdulaziz, the Saudi oil minister at the time, insisted that this was not political. This was at 2 weeks before the U.S. midterm elections. He insisted it wasn't, and he continues to insist, it was based on market fundamentals, not to hurt President Biden's allies in the election. Now we're seeing the same kind of behavior with oil around $80 a barrel, a production cut again. As Mark said, the surprise here, I think, is in the timing. And the behavior is, I think it's consistent really with this more hawkish, more interventionist, new, forceful, headstrong, whatever you want to call it, oil market strategy that we're seeing.
Two quick questions. First, what about the UAE? In the fall, the UAE differed sharply and publicly from Saudi strategy on the production cuts. What's happening this time around? Mark?
Radio silence, from as far as I can tell. The UAE is one of the countries that is participating in the cuts. I haven't seen or heard any voice of concern, at least publicly. At least from what we know so far, they're on board with this surprise approach and cut.
But it's a smaller proportional cut than they underwent last time, right? They've been yelling about having a bigger proportional cut than others. This time around, I think they got an easier ride, right?
All the cuts were exactly proportional, in line with their quotas. So every one of the individual country reductions that was announced is the exact same to the 10th of a percentage point reduction relative to their current quota. And by the way, the only countries that participated in cutting production in this agreement are the countries that can. There's a number of countries who are already underproducing relative to their quotas for various reasons, and those countries were all left out of this agreement.
Second question, there's been press speculation that the trigger in terms of timing may have been the U.S. announcement or U.S. indications that it was not going to be proceeding with the refill of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at the same pace as previously thought. What do you think? Factor?
I think it definitely aligns with this decision. I mean, I was going to talk about this when we get into energy security, but the fact that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is only partially full and the U.S. missed its chance with oil prices down at 70 or so to refill it, I think it would dissuade President Biden from using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve again for the same purpose that he did back in October, to try and use it as a source of spare capacity to push down prices.
So, Jim, what does this mean overall for energy security? Are we vulnerable in some fashion we were not a week ago?
I think it's negative in the short term for oil security, right? I mean, I think, in the longer term, energy security is slowly but surely improving through renewables, right? Which don't use fuel. They don't have a fuel supply chain that needs to stay connected 24/7, 365, right? They have a supply chain that connects to when it's under construction, and when you plug it into the grid, the supply chain disappears. So they're more secure from that standpoint. But for oil, yeah, I mean, the U.S., we are the largest producer and we're self-sufficient, but, the Saudis are the biggest exporter, and that's where price formation really starts, and they've got much more say, as we're seeing, over prices. And unfortunately, Biden, for the short run, we don't have a full strategic petroleum reserve, and that leaves us more exposed to risks in the oil market. We have less of a chance or an opportunity to use the SPR to deal with those shortages.
Yeah, I think the administration last year used the SPR very aggressively in concert with its allies within the International Energy Agency to try to tamp down prices. And it was a year-long program. And as a result, as Jim notes, the U.S. strategic stockpile is the smallest it's been in probably 40 years. Perversely, one wrinkle for energy security that might fall into the plus side is when OPEC cuts production, OPEC spare capacity goes up. And spare capacity is typically the first line of defense in the energy security playbook if something goes wrong. Now, of course, what we've seen over the last year is that the countries that held the spare capacity elected not to use it.
So we went to emergency stocks.
Then that goes back to the geopolitical relationships.
Right. So they've got to use that spare capacity.
Okay. Kristian, I'm going to take advantage of my position as director and moderator to offer an assessment, which I will open up to your commentary and critique, that a lot of what we're watching right now is indeed an indication of different circumstances and different personalities at the helm. You have MBS with extraordinary financing needs for the giga projects in Saudi Arabia, close to $1 trillion, which he doesn't have, are needed, beyond his ongoing expenses to modernize the kingdom in a more normal fashion. You have Vladimir Putin, who also needs as much cash as he can generate to support this ruinous war in the Ukraine without undue costs at home beyond what he's already paying. The combination of these two characters in need of as much money as possible, disconnected from any historical political relationships, seems to be what we're watching here. That this isn't a finger in the eye of the U.S. or a cozying up to Russia, if you want to cast it in those lines. These are two individuals, after capturing as much cash as they can from a commodity which may not yield what they want, predictably, for long periods of time, so get it while the getting is good and then try to keep it as high as possible. What do you think?
It is certainly the case that domestic interest and self-interest on the part of the leaders, Mohammed bin Salman and Vladimir Putin, is absolutely critical to what they're trying to do. And from Mohammed bin Salman's perspective, it's almost exactly 7 years since he announced Vision 2030 in April 2016. We're now at that halfway point. As you said, there are conventional aims to modernize and transform Saudi Arabia, get more women into the workforce, investing in mining and minerals and supply chains. But there's also a whole raft of giga projects and other major initiatives, such as the new airline that was recently announced, or the massive expansion of the airport in a part of the world which already has huge existing aviation hubs. And these giga projects have shown signs of under-delivery so far. We're moving into the critical phase where they will have to be implemented. Mohammed bin Salman has put so much of his personal credibility as the man who can transform Saudi Arabia into Vision 2030, into the notion that he and only he can achieve what Saudi Arabia needs to move beyond oil. And having said in 2016, when he announced Vision 2030, that he thought that Saudi Arabia could live without oil by 2020, he now finds himself in the opposite context, where he is locked into a requirement for higher oil prices to generate those revenues, which he hopes will power the giga projects to completion. Partly because foreign investment into Saudi Arabia fell sharply in 2017 after the Ritz-Carlton detentions. The international investor community felt unsure of whether the people they were going to do business with would suddenly disappear or the business might be captured by the Saudi state. So a lot of the investment that the Saudis may have anticipated coming in hasn't materialized. They're having to pay for the giga projects themselves. And my question is, as we get closer to 2030, will we see more of these moves to try to act unpredictably, to try to ensure the revenue coming in, as Mohammed bin Salman feels, or perhaps the people around him, feel under pressure to show results because he's put so much of his credibility on the line to deliver.
And what about the U.S. Saudi strategic relationship? It's clearly undergone significant both strain and changes which are not the product of tension, but natural evolution by both parties concerned. Where do you see this going?
Well, I think unlike previous points of friction, such as the Arab oil embargo in 1973, the fallout from 9/11, this is now a relationship that has frayed across multiple kings and successive US presidents, 3 at least. So it's not purely a matter of one specific issue. It seems to be fraying at both ends for different reasons. Mohammed bin Salman is 37 years old. He hopes to remain in charge of Saudi Arabia at least for mid-century and beyond. He is reacting to a changing world around him. We see the recent agreement with Iran, brokered by China, again to de-risk and to take points of tension out of the regional equation, while he needs to focus on domestic issues at home. And we see him using the Chinese to get that deal over the line. Mohammed bin Salman is trying to ensure that the world around him changes and that Saudi Arabia is at the leading that change, not reacting. And where that leaves the US is one of many partners, not perhaps the special relationship, the oil for security relationship we had in the past. Mohammed bin Salman sees China as a long-term partner. He sees other countries as there for the long term. He doesn't know the same about the US. He's not sure where that leaves the relationship going forward, 10 years from now, perhaps.
And so, Mark, where do we go from here? You first.
I think that your point, Ambassador Satterfield, about revenue needs is exactly right. And I would point out that in the oil market, if you're Saudi Arabia and you want to make as much money as possible today, you will always cut production and go for a higher price. The problem is it's not sustainable to do that over longer time periods. You've got a lot of resources in the ground, and at some point, the high price becomes counterproductive because it will discourage demand and encourage alternative sources of supply. And so trying to thread the needle between today's financial needs and kind of long-term strategic interests, I think will always be an issue. On the issue of the need to keep surprising the market, one thing I'm struck by is that Saudi officials like to refer to themselves as the central bank of the oil market. Since Sunday, I've been asking friends of mine who are in central banking, do central banks put out guidance and then deliberately counter that to surprise and shock the market? Generally not, because the point of your forward guidance is to kind of show the market that you're trying to be credible and transparent in your decision making. And so you can't have it both ways. You can be a transparent, stabilizing force, or you could be an agent of surprise. That, I think, there's some tension there. I'd also just qualify the U.S. Saudi relationship. It's still the case that the Fifth Fleet is in Bahrain. The Saudis announced just very recently they were going to buy a lot of Boeings for their new airline. And at least so far, they've resisted Chinese and Russian lobbying to change the basis for pricing crude oil away from dollars. And so I think while there are always strains in the relationship and they're high now, there's still some fundamental underpinnings to the relationship.
Great. Jim?
So I would say that there's probably potential, I think, for more separation between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. And we're seeing Saudi Arabia getting closer to China. They're maintaining this relationship with Russia that seems to be very important in Saudi Arabia. With the U.S., this sort of transactional relationship that seems to fluctuate, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat administration now. We'll see if that pattern continues. But it seems like the more that Americans start to move away from internal combustion engine vehicles, and not just Americans, American voters, the more American voters move into EVs or hybrids, more efficient cars, I think that's going to reduce the pressure on the U.S.-Saudi relationship. I think this negative correlation that we know about between presidential popularity and the oil price makes U.S. presidents cautious around Saudi Arabia because of voters' sensitivity to high gasoline prices. But as voters switch to electric vehicles or to more efficient vehicles, they're going to be less exposed to oil price fluctuations, less exposed to that risk. I think that's going to give the president a freer hand in foreign policy with oil-producing countries. Doesn't mean oil demand goes away. U.S. is obviously still a big oil consumer. Oil prices are still going to feed into inflation and affect us, in a secondary way. But I think U.S. voters will feel less direct exposure through their own purchases of gasoline, the more that they go into EVs. And I think that'll reflect itself eventually in what presidents do.
Kristian, last word.
Well, I think this is another milestone in what we've seen over the past year since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where Saudi Arabia, the UAE, much of the global south doesn't feel that they are taking sides in this great power competition, these strategic rivalries, and that they are going to act to project their own interests where they can. And if they align with the US or the West, then so be it. But if they don't, that's another issue as well. And so I think the OPEC Plus agreement, or the cuts that have been announced, are just part of that diversification of relationships that I think we're going to have to get used to in this much more multipolar world.
And on that note, getting used to a much more multipolar world and not viewing everything through a binary prism of, is it a poke in the eye to the United States or a cozying up to Beijing or Moscow? That's going to take a lot of reflection, a lot of thought, because it is a different world than the one we have all been in since 1945. But on that, thank you all, and thanks to our audience.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
The Baker Institute provides meaningful policy analyses on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. This episode was produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. AV production was provided by Kevin Young. Many thanks to the Baker Institute interns who assisted with this episode: Maya Adekare, Sarah Davidson, and Lisa Jacob. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording on the campus of Rice University, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thank you for listening.